I'm Michelle Shipworth. I'm an associate professor at University College London. I'm in the department for the Bartlett School of Environment, Energy and Resources. In October last year, I ran for the 10th time a seminar where I asked students, as part of a data detectives module, I asked students, why are there so many slaves in China? Now, this is the fourth week in a seminar series that is all about data detectives. It's all about the critical evaluation of factual claims, secondary data. It was all about them developing really strong arguments, providing them with all the tools to demonstrate that actually we don't have a slavery problem in China. I had the students working in small groups all around the class. There are about 80 students in the class, and they're all working in small groups. And I went around to 3 of those groups, happened to speak to Chinese students on each table, to check that they were doing as I expected, i.e. critiquing the claim, evaluating the claim, and already starting to challenge the claim. Students on 3 different tables were already doing exactly what I expected, asking excellent questions like, how are you defining slavery? Is it just that people are working very hard? Or pointing out that the slide said 2014 and the data set was out of date. Then I gave them a lecture that lasted for 15 or 20 minutes that utterly demolished the report and the data set. I use this particular data set and report because it is the worst I've ever come across. It gives them just fantastic opportunity to demonstrate that they've learned what we've covered up in the 11 hours prior to the seminar. It was during that last few minutes that one Chinese student on an all-Chinese table, one student stood up and said, well, why did you ask such a provocative question? And I would say that his tone of voice was slightly cross. And I just took it as a great question, honestly. It felt to me, okay, so it puzzled me at the time because I thought, well, we've been 45 minutes demolishing this. I would have thought it would be very, very obvious why I used it is to help you critique the data set. But I then explained it more thoroughly. I just explained that I do this because there's good evidence that if you disagree with a claim being made, that you are going to put a lot of effort into showing why that claim is wrong. Yeah. And in this case, that means you're going to put a lot of effort into finding all of the methodological reasons why this data set is flawed. An email came in a few days later. Initially, there was the one saying that a student had reported to another member of staff that this other student, I believe not Chinese, when they observed the Chinese student being slightly cross, that this other student had got upset by that. So I just found that quite surreal, honestly. I found it difficult to process that someone would A, get upset that someone else has got cross, and B, feel the need to report that to the staff. And the thing that astonished me most of all is that the staff would then think that I need to sort of respond to this in somehow. I wanted to develop an activity for the next week for the tutorial classes based around the Constructive Dialogue Institute. And I wanted to look into, well, what was the actual psychological theory that I was drawing on. So I started doing that on the Monday and was really flabbergasted to get a phone call from my head of department out of the blue saying that apparently a few Chinese students were upset about this particular seminar. And I basically walked him through how I teach, that I've been teaching, using this exercise for 10 years, and explained to him that the students had given these really great answers at the end of the seminar, that very clearly they learned a lot from the exercise. And And he just kept praising my innovative teaching during that. And then all of a sudden, the next day, I was prevented from teaching. So I was prevented from uploading a teaching activity to Moodle, a learning platform, and I was prevented from emailing my students. Colleagues had got worried that students were upset by this particular exercise this year. And colleagues had got so worried about it that they decided that not only that I needed to write to my students, which I was going to be doing anyway, but they decided that they needed to edit what I say to my students and that I needed to have that edited by a variety of my colleagues. Now, to make the context for this, I'm a much more experienced teacher than most of these colleagues. Not only have I been teaching this module for 10 years, I was teaching for a number of years prior to that in the UK. Prior to that, I'd received training from the Department of Immigration in cross-cultural communication. During all of this period, no one had ever reprimanded me or in any way suggested that any of my communications were inappropriate. And no one had told me that I did anything wrong now. So because I hadn't done anything wrong, I just kept sending emails to insist that my editing rights be reinstated. And eventually that happened. And they still insisted that I needed to submit my proposed email to colleagues for their clearance. So I just went ahead and emailed my students. I emailed my students and I uploaded the teaching activity for the next day. And then I let people know that that's what I'd done. And then I went in to teach the following day. And what was quite interesting is that the particular student who had complained the week before and had seemed a bit cross, that particular student came in beaming, had a great big grin on his face, surrounded by Chinese students who were all grinning as well, smiling at me, grinning at me, and came right to the front of the class and sat in a table at the front of the class, which seemed to me like unusual behavior for someone who is actually distressed. A week after that, some of my colleagues asked to meet with me, and during that meeting, I would describe it as they harangued me to insist that that particular exercise be dropped for future years. They were adamant that the students were distressed by this. I didn't see distress, and B, for me, the reason I didn't want to drop the exercise was because I had extremely good written evidence from how the students had responded that it was a very high quality teaching exercise. And from my point of view, that's my job, is to provide high quality teaching rather than to bend to the demands of a couple of students. Eventually, because it felt like I was harangued for so long, I agreed. I have a lot of experience in interacting, including with very upset students. When I was in AusAid, you might have students who've been told that they're not going to be able to get an extension to their scholarship, or alternatively, in some cases, even their supervisor has turned on them and said, no, I'm not going to support you any further for your PhD. Even if the students are distressed, then for me, that's an indication that we need to help them cope with hearing a view that they disagree with. If the activity wasn't a good teaching activity, if people aren't learning things from it, then that's definitely, a case where I would look at it again. But in this case, I had overwhelming evidence that it was a good learning activity. So why would I downgrade the teaching because of the demands of one or two students? If the students are struggling either to hear a view that they disagree with or to hear someone else be a bit cross, then my thinking is we need to be giving them the various intellectual and possibly emotional tools to deal with that and the skill set, if you like, experience of that. Maybe we need something like a summer school to help the students learn to disagree. Do we need some extramural activities to help them disagree? That would be my response. I just don't think that we can say, oh, you're finding this difficult, right, well, we shouldn't do it. That's not what a university education is about. I just find it utterly bizarre that it needs saying, to be honest. Our UCL provost, President and Provost Michael Spence, he's got this initiative, because he recognises that we've got a problem with this in universities, and he's had this initiative going on for about a year, I think, called Disagreeing Well, and I'm one of the invited academics to be on the academic panel for that Disagreeing Well initiative. And I think it was relatively early in January that an email came around saying that he was convening a get-together roundtable, closed roundtable of us academic panel and a few other people to basically talk about essentially disagreeing well in teaching and, the extent to which we do or don't need to be providing safe spaces, emotionally safe spaces for students. So I did a brief summary of what had happened, anonymizing wherever I possibly could. I did it for my senior Disagreeing Well academic panel colleagues. I gave them all the crucial details about it. And although it was Chatham House rule at the meeting, what I can safely say, the meeting included the provost and a whole bunch of senior colleagues from UCL. All of the senior colleagues in the meeting agreed, first of all, that my academic freedom had been infringed when my editing rights were turned off. And the other thing that the senior colleagues all agreed on at the Disagreeing Well in Teaching event was that UCL needs more training on academic freedom, especially heads of department, but anyone with any kind of leadership position. The overwhelming view expressed at the meeting was that this is a clear indication that we very much need training at UCL on this. So I was so relieved about this that I actually wrote to my head of department and teaching colleagues to say, look, to highlight to them, look, these senior colleagues, think that my academic freedom was infringed in this exercise, and do think that teaching quality is overwhelmingly what's important here. And so I assumed that my email to my own colleagues would have them go, oops, yeah, okay, well, we did, must have overstepped the mark there, and we'll try and take that into account. 2 days later, 2 report and support allegations were submitted against me. So the report and support portal is it's intended for reports of bullying or harassment or sexual harassment. But the claims that were submitted against me were that I was biased against Chinese students. So not that I was even biased against Chinese people, but that I was biased against Chinese students, which I found utterly surreal. And they were anonymous, so I don't know who submitted them. I then inquired as to what the claims were in relation to that. So what was the summary of these claims? And the summary of the claims were the exercise, that was somehow evidence that I was biased against Chinese students, that I had found a couple of my Chinese students over the previous 10 years had been contract cheating. In one case, I was able to detect that there was a fraudulent application. In another case, a student was getting a body double to hold dissertation meetings with me. That was being used against me, I found extraordinary. And then another reason that was given a claim of bias against me was that I had made a Chinese student feel embarrassed in class because they couldn't answer a question. Now, in this particular module, I ask all of my students questions and they know that in advance. And then I was also told that I was tweeting just about China and academic freedom. And I could only literally find, nearly all my tweets about academic freedom are to do with the situation in the UK and the US. And I literally could find one tweet that vaguely related to China and academic freedom. It was merely me quoting a UK academic of Chinese heritage who was arguing for the importance of academic integrity. So those were the initial claims against me. After that, then I had an informal meeting with my head of department. And during that meeting, he concluded that he couldn't find any evidence that I was biased against Chinese students. Kel surprise. So he couldn't find any evidence. But notwithstanding that, he then imposed certain restrictions on my teaching. It just blew my mind. And one of those restrictions included, we're going to take your module away from you and give it to a colleague. Now, this particular module, I invented the concept of data detectives. I don't know of any other module in existence that does what this module does. I've developed all the content over 10 years, and during the pandemic year, I did nothing else other than turn the module into these online tasks for the students to help the students as much as possible to work online by themselves. I've had students write to me who are very beginner and very advanced, both telling me how valuable they found the module. So proposing to basically take all of that work away from me and give it to a colleague, that really just that just blew my mind, honestly. And there were a few other restrictions that are actually impossible to fulfill. Things like if I'm using a case study, I can't use just one country at a time. It needs to be comparative. Not everything is comparative, so it's not possible for me to do that. And the other requirement placed on me was that I find other ways to engage my Chinese students that doesn't involve asking them questions in class. It felt as though we weren't prioritizing teaching quality anymore, that we were instead prioritizing students having hurt feelings, but also having hurt feelings for no particular reason. It was at that point, I think it took me a couple of weeks to recover from it, actually, before I even reached out again to the Free Speech Union, who've been amazing through all of this, because I first spoke to them when the incident first flared up, and they helped me through it at that point. They helped me cope with it, sort of both emotionally and practically. They helped me through it. And then, I think it was a week or two after this that I reached out to them again, sort of in despair. And we spoke about options. And it was after that I thought it felt like my only option was to go public with it. And not just because it felt like that was the only way I was going to get my module back and my teaching restrictions lifted, but far, far more importantly, that I realized that we have a monumentally big problem with academic freedom. And I feel as though I'm in a position where if the worst case scenario happens and I lose my job, my husband and I will survive. Even if we have to sell our home and move to something cheaper, we'll survive at least, So it feels as though, I'm relatively protected in that sense. So I just felt like I had an obligation, honestly, to raise the alarm that we have a massive problem. It's not just overseas student fees that we've become very reliant on, but we have increasingly started to see our students as consumers, if you like, or clients. I'm so worried that so many of my colleagues are starting to see it, I don't know, like some kind of beauty salon. I don't think we're some kind of beauty salon where we're just asking what color would you like your nails painted today. Universities are something special. We're places where we create new knowledge, where we understand, where we think about, very carefully think about how do we know anything in the world. As someone who's involved in sort of climate change issues, for instance, I can't see how we will navigate through, what some people term a climate crisis, but at least a enormous climate difficulties, if you like, and other difficulties. I don't see how we will navigate through those without very high quality science. And we can only have the very high quality science if we're able to ask each other challenging questions, and also help our students do that as well, and as well as just learning from us, if you like. What is the point of them coming to university otherwise if they're not actually going to be getting the best quality education? Otherwise, what are we, just a certificate writing service? Education is not like any other service either. It's not a consumer good. My assumption is that my colleagues are just like in a blind panic about potentially losing student fees. Absolute blind panic about having fewer Chinese students come next year. It really worries me that colleagues then end up forgetting that that's not what we're doing here. That what we're doing here is we're doing an education, and our job is to do the very highest quality education that we can. I guess there's two ways where it's been really difficult. I mean, emotionally, it's been extremely challenging. My mental health took a bit of a nosedive, and my husband helped glue me back together again. And then I found November, December just difficult, but I sort of struggled on as best I could. And then February, after this all went completely crazy as far as I was concerned at my departmental level, that was pretty bad as well. One of the things that I found most frustrating is that I have just lost hundreds of hours of time throughout this whole thing. It has just robbed hundreds of hours of my time because I've been overwhelmed and had to just almost be full-time just managing this ridiculous blow-up. The time that I had remaining, I would say a vast amount of it was going on trying to deal with this issue in a way that would hopefully be reasonable.